Well, hello, friends. I had a short day at work, so you're going to get a rare daylight reading for me. Maybe not rare. Who knows? Maybe it'll be the new thing. Let me know what you think of the more natural lighting. And instead of coffee, I have a nice herbal tea today. Temperature is just right. And if you're just joining us, we're reading through this book, All About Love by Bell Hooks. We are on chapter 5. Let me double check. Make sure I am speaking correctly. Yes, chapter 5. If you don't know, we have a community on Discord. You can join by going to the link in my bio if you're interested. Join through Patreon, and you can join us there if you want to get to know me more. Otherwise, you can find me on other socials such as Instagram and the TikTok. And I wanna start a Facebook. I don't, because Facebook, right? But it's also like kind of necessary. Not necessary. It's just the metaverse is still losing relevance, but it's still an important integration of the system. So we'll be there eventually. But if you want to look up Dope Dad, you can find me on TikTok. If you want to engage with me there, that's awesome. If you want to get to know me a little bit more in the community that we're developing, you can join, like I said, through the Patreon. So with no further ado, chapter 5, Spirituality, Divine Love. I have some friends that are reading this book with me, and they're a little bit further ahead. And as I've expressed in other videos, I love Bell Hooks. I think she's fantastic. But I think either in this chapter or the next one, they've expressed a few things that they were like, And so there's discussion over, is this just a product of the time that the book was written in, or, so it'll be interesting to see if we get in those disagreements. Chapter 5, Spirituality, Divine Love. As a woman and a lover, however, I am moved by the sight of my beloved. Where he is, I want to be. What he suffers, I want to share. Who he is, I want to be. Crucified for love. Saint Teresa of Avila. Living life in touch with divine spirit lets us see the light of love in all living beings. That light is a resurrecting life force. A culture that is dead to love can only be resurrected by spiritual awakening. On the surface, it appears that our nation has gone so far down the road of secular individualism, worshiping the twin gods of money and power, that there seems to be no place for spiritual life. Yet, an overwhelming majority of Americans who express faith in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or other religion traditions clearly believe that spiritual life is important. The crisis of American life does not seem to be generated by a lack of interest in spirituality. However, this interest is constantly co-opted by the powerful forces of materialism and hedonistic consumerism. Definitely agree there. In the conclusion to his insightful work, The Art of Loving, written in the mid-50s but still relevant to today's world, psychoanalyst Erich Fromm courageously calls attention to the reality that, that tea wanted not to stay down my throat. The principle underlying capitalistic society and the principle of love are incompatible. He contends, our society is run by a managerial bureaucracy, by professional politicians. People are motivated by mass suggestion. Their aim is producing more and consuming more as purposes in themselves. The cultural emphasis on endless consumption deflects attention from spiritual hunger. Ooh. Have you guys ever heard of a concept, let me know in the comments below, called spiritual bypassing? It was a thing that kind of helped me when I started deconstructing my Christian faith. If you don't know, I still identify as a Christian, even though I don't know, and I do not like what my hair is doing today. That's what happens when you walk in straight from work and sit down and start recording, but that's okay. But this idea of spiritual bypassing, and it basically is a way that lots of people in religious traditions can kind of jump over doing deep reflective work, like the work that I would say a lot of religious traditions kind of beckon us to do. So instead of reflecting, you're like, I'll pray about it. Well, the Lord has a plan. And these are all ways to like advocate your responsibility as a person who has these supposedly deeply held beliefs, and to act consistently within them, right? So if you believe in grace, right, and compassion, and you don't act consistently, and then you just go, instead of thinking critically through it, and just go, well, God will sort it out. That's kind of a type of spiritual bypassing. And so what this makes me think of is when Eric Fromm says their aim is producing more and consuming more as purposes in themselves. It almost makes me wonder if culturally materialism is kind of a form of spiritual bypassing. Like, instead of doing the deep reflective work of trying to figure out what would satisfy us, we end up in this loop of producing and consuming, producing and consuming, producing and consuming. You know, it's just a thought that popped in my head. Let me know what you think. The cultural emphasis on endless consumption deflects attention from spiritual hunger. That's what made me think of the spiritual bypassing. We are endlessly bombarded by messages telling us that our every need can be satisfied by material increase. Artist Barbara Kruger created a work proclaiming, "I shop, therefore I am," to show the way consumerism has taken over mass consciousness, making people think they are what they possess. Yeah, like, think about how that adds to your identity, right? Like, we often measure ourselves and our value and our place in society by material possession, and then we also judge others by material possession or lack of material possession, and we also assign a value, and we make large leaps and assumptions about them. While the zeal to possess intensifies, so does the sense of spiritual emptiness. Because we are spiritually empty, we try to fill up on consumerism. We may not have enough love, but we can always shop. Our national spiritual hunger springs from a keen awareness of the emotional lack in our lives. It is a response to lovelessness. Going to church or temple has not satisfied this hunger. Surfacing from deep within our souls, organized religion has failed to satisfy spiritual hunger because it has accommodated secular demands, interpreting spiritual life in ways that uphold the values of a production-centered commodity culture. Yeah, I'm glad that this is in there, that there's like at least a nod to a critique against organized religion, because what I've noticed is that, and this is part of my deconstruction, is a lot of organized religion is like, hey, we offer that spiritual fulfillment, but then what they do is just repackage the same consumerism, but in spiritual dressing. This is as true of the traditional Christian church as it is of New Age spirituality. It is no accident that so many famous New Age spiritual teachers link their teachings to a metaphysics of daily life that extols the virtues of wealth, privilege, and power. For example, consider New Age logic, which suggests that the poor have chosen to be poor, have chosen their suffering. Such thinking removes from all of us who are privileged the burden of accountability. Rather than calling us to embrace love and greater community, it actually requires an investment in the logic of alienation and estrangement. That's kind of more, and maybe I'm using the term wrong, I'm willing to be educated on it, more of that spiritual bypassing. Like, we don't have to really think about our participation in these oppressive systems. We can just blame it off. And I see this not even outside of the spiritual world. I see this in naturalistic viewpoints where people kind of blame everything on biology or genetic predisposition. Jordan Peterson does this a lot, where he's like, well, these social hierarchies are just natural, and they're a byproduct of your own evolution and your own deeply held, biological neurobiological processes. And he like basically applies things to social constructs where they should not be applied. There's Some More News is a great channel that did like a 3-hour deep dive on Peterson if you want to learn more about that. The basic interdependency of life is ignored so that separateness and individual gain can be defied. Religious fundamentalism is often represented as authentic spiritual practice and given a level of mass media exposure that countercultural religious thought and practice never receive. 100%. Usually fundamentalists, be they Christian, Muslim, or any faith, shape and interpret religious thought to make it conform and to legitimize a conservative status quo. Fundamentalist thinkers use religion to justify supporting imperialism, militarism, sexism, racism, homophobia. They deny the unifying message of love that is at the heart of every major religious tradition. And right now, it's also being used to legitimize racism, fascism, neo-Nazi, Christian nationalism. This, in case you're seeing this in some far-off distant future, was recorded in February of 2023. There's literally a church organization. I don't know what their larger church affiliation is, but it's a network of churches called Patriot Church. And it is literally based around the idea of Christian nationalism under this disguise, this falsity. No wonder then that so many people who claim to believe in religious teachings do not allow their habits of being to reflect these beliefs. That's what I was saying earlier, spiritual bypassing. For example, the Christian church remains one of the most racially segregated institutions in our society. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to American Christians, in which he assumes the persona of the biblical apostle Paul, he admonishes believers for supporting segregation. Americans, I must urge you to be rid of every aspect of segregation. Segregation is a blatant denial of the unity which we have in Christ. It substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and regulates persons to the status of things. It scars the soul and degrades the personality. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. This is only one example of the way in which organized religious worship corrupts and violates religious principles about how we should live in the world and how we should act towards one another. Imagine how different our lives would be if all the individuals who claim to be Christian or who claim to be religious were setting an example for everyone by being loving. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, there's no love like Christian hate. Blatant misuses of spirituality and religious faith could lead us to despair about spiritual life if we were not simultaneously witnessing a genuine concern for spiritual awakening expressed counterculturally. Whether it is the American Buddhists working in solidarity to free Tibet or the many Christian-based organizations that provide support in the way of food and shelter for the need globally, these embodiments of loving practice renew our hope and restore the soul. All around the world, liberation theology offers the exploited and oppressed a vision of spiritual freedom that is linked to struggles and to end denomination. Liberation theology has also been super helpful in my own deconstruction, and I'll admit that I've barely skimmed the surface of it, but I'm like, this makes lots of sense. A little more than 10 years after Fromm first published The Art of Loving, Martin Luther King Jr.'s collection of sermons, Strength to Love, was published. The major focus of these talks was the celebration of love as a spiritual force that unites and binds all life. Like Fromm's earlier work, these essays champion spiritual life, critiquing capitalism, materialism, and the violence used to enforce exploitation and dehumanization. In a 1967 lecture opposing war, King declared, "When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of the force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality." This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. "Let us love one another, for love is God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God." Throughout his life, King was a prophet of love. In the late 70s, when it was no longer cool to talk about spirituality, I found myself turning again and again to his work and the work of Thomas Merton. As religious seekers and thinkers, both men focus attention on the practice of love as a means of spiritual fulfillment. I love that. I like what King says here. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. How often do we tie love and things attached to love to weakness, right? And I think one way that happens is we tend to, which is cultural, this is not what I believe, but we tend to view masculine things as tough and feminine things as weak. And a lot of the attributes of love tend to get tied to femininity. So then, speaking as a man, when you're socialized, and like the thoughts you receive is to push back against things that could be feminine or be perceived as weak. And I think for men in particular, and Belle talks about this in her other book, The Will to Change, like it leads to men who lose the ability to love because they've been told that at best love is something they receive and not something that they can give and cultivate, whether within themselves and for themselves, right? But that it's something that not only that they need to receive from outside of them, but it's also something that they're entitled to. So yeah, so for me, a big part of my healing has been learning to love myself and learning to access the spots of myself to where I can just love people genuinely. And what I would add is that it doesn't make you weak. Extolling the transformative power of love in his essay, Love and Need, Merton writes, love is, in fact, an intensification of life, a completeness, a fullness, a wholeness of life. Life curves upwards to a peak of intensity, a high point of value and meaning, at which all its latent creative possibility go into action, and the person transcends himself or herself in the encounter, response, and communion with another. It is for this that we came into the world, this communion and self-transcendence. We do not become fully human until we give ourselves to each other in love. The teachings about love offered by Fromm, King, and Merton differ from much of today's writing. There is always an emphasis in their work on love as an active force that should lead us into greater communion with the world. In their work, loving practice is not aimed at simply giving an individual greater life satisfaction. It is extolled as the primary way we end domination and oppression. This important politicization of love is often absent from today's writing. Much as I enjoyed popular New Age commentary on love, I am often struck by the dangerous narcissism fostered by spiritual rhetoric that pays so much attention to individual self-improvement and so little to the practice of love within the context of community. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine earlier today, in fact, who is kind of like a community organizer in religious institutions. And he talks about how a lot of people think that if we can just change ideologies, like people's thinking, that will solve everything. And he's like, that's part of it, and it's not insignificant. And he's like, but it's not true if you can't organize power. And he said power is basically the culmination of resource in the form of money or people. And so I love like what Belle is saying here. Attention to individual self-improvement and so little to the practice of love within the context of community. Like that's the big difference. Like if we want to see things change and grow, it comes down to community love and community interaction, community involvement, people moving and pulling power from systems of oppression and consolidating it within themselves as a community, not as individuals. It's that giving power back to people. We read a book maybe June of last year in our book club. Again, you can join us, called Mutual Aid, that talks a lot about that. Packaged as commodity, spirituality becomes no different from an exercise program. While it may leave the consumer feeling better about his or her life, its power to enhance our communion with ourselves and others is in a sustained way is inhibited. Commenting on the value of an engaged life in the active life, wisdom of work, creativity, and caring, Parker Palmer writes, to be fully alive is to act. I understand action to be any way that we can co-create reality with other beings and the spirit. Action, like a sacrament, is the visible form of an invisible spirit, an outward manifestation of an inward power. But as we act, we not only express what is in us and help give shape to the world, we also receive what is outside us and reshape our inner selves. A commitment to a spiritual life requires us to do more than read a good book or go on a restful retreat. It requires conscious practice, a willingness to unite the way we think with the way we act. Yeah, man, I grew up in church. Like, what was it? Jesus' brother allegedly said, which was faith without works is dead. Like, that's literally this. Are you willing to unite the way you think, what you believe, what you say are your values to the way you act? Spiritual life is the first and foremost about commitment to a way of thinking and behaving that honors the principles of inner being and interconnectedness. When I speak of the spiritual, I refer to the recognition within everyone that there is a place of mystery in our lives where forces that are beyond human desire or will alter circumstances or guide and direct us. I call these forces divine spirit. When we choose to lead a spirit-filled life, we recognize and celebrate the presence of transcendent spirits. Some people call this presence soul, God, the beloved, higher conscience, or higher power. Still others say that this force is what it is because it cannot be named. To them, it is simply the Spirit moving in us and through us. A commitment to spiritual life necessarily means we embrace the internal principle that love is all, everything, our true destiny. Despite overwhelming pressure to conform to the culture of lovelessness, we seek to know love. That seeking itself is a manifestation of divine spirit. Life-threatening nihilism abounds in contemporary culture, crossing the boundaries of race, class, gender, and nationality. At some point, it affects all of our lives. Everyone I know is at times brought low by feelings of depression and despair about the state of the world. Whether it is on the I'm having trouble with the word weather today. Not weather as in like what's going on outside, but whether or not. Whether it is ongoing worldwide presence of violence expressed by the persistence of man-made war, hunger, and starvation, the day-to-day reality of violence, the presence of life-threatening diseases that cause the unexpected death of friends, comrades, and loved ones, there is much that brings everyone to the brink of despair. Knowing love, or the hope of knowing love, is the anchor that keeps us from falling into a sea of despair. In A Path with Heart, Jack Kornfield shares, the longing for love and the movement of love is underneath all of our activities. Spirituality and spiritual life give us strength to love. It is rare for individuals to choose a life in the spirit, one that honors the sacred dimensions of everyday life when they have had no contact with traditional religious thought or practice. Spiritual teachers are important guides who provide a catalyst for our spiritual awakening. Another source of spiritual growth is communion and fellowship with like-minded souls. Spiritual seekers let their light shine so that others may see, not only to give service by example, but also to constantly remind themselves that spirituality is most gloriously embodied in our actions and our habits of being. Insightfully, Jack Kornfield explains, all other spiritual teachings are in vain if we cannot love. Even the most exalted states and the most exceptional spiritual accomplishments are unimportant if we cannot be happy in the most basic and ordinary ways, if, with our hearts, we cannot touch one another and the life we have been given. What matters is how we live. Reminds me of, I think it was Paul who talks about in the New Testament, like, if you basically do all these things in the name of God, but you have not love, you're basically just a loud, clanging cymbal. You're empty. There's nothing going on. Even though externally you look like there's a lot going on. For many of us, church was the place where we first heard a counter narrative of love, one that differed from the confused messages about love learned in dysfunctional families, the mystical dimensions of Christian faith, the belief that we are all one, that love is all, presented to me as a child in the church were the space of redemption. At church, I learned not only to understand that God is love, I learned also that children were special in the heart and mind of the divine spirit. Dreaming of becoming a writer, valuing the life of the mind above all things, it was especially awesome to learn by heart passages from First Corinthians, the love chapter. From childhood on, I have often reflected on the passage that proclaims, if I speak with tongues, this is the one I was just talking about, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver my body to be burned, but have not loved, I gain nothing. Throughout my graduate school years, as I worked hard to finish my doctorate, striving to maintain a commitment to spiritual life in a world that did not value the spiritual, I returned to these lessons about the primacy of love. I read that twice, my bad. The wisdom they convey kept me from hardening my heart. Remaining open to love was crucial to my academic survival. When the environment you live in and know most intimately does not place value on loving, a spiritual life provides a place of solace and renewal. Significantly, the gaining of knowledge about spirituality is not the same as a commitment to a spiritual life. Jack Kornfield testifies, in undertaking a spiritual life, what matters is simple. We must make certain our path is connected with our heart. In beginning a genuine spiritual journey, we have to stay much closer to home, to focus directly on what is right here in front of us, to make sure that our path is connected with our deepest love. A lot of times when I talk to people, them trying to help work through their own stuff the same way I've worked through mine, we talk about alignments in inner alignments, like what matters to you, what are the things that you value, and then you make sure from there that your life, your actions follow those values. If your life is not following those, so if you value community and you're not participating in community, well, then your actions are disconnecting you from your values. And so you have to go, well, is that actually something I value? Which is fine if you don't. And if it is something that you do truly value and you're not participating in it, then you're going to find yourself most likely feeling empty. And so it's one of those things. It's like, I can't answer for you, but what is it you really want? You know what I mean? And kind of start there. Where we go? When we begin to experience the sacred in our everyday lives, we bring to the mundane task a quality of concentration and engagement that lifts the spirit. We recognize divine spirit everywhere. This is especially true when we face difficulties. So many people turn to spiritual thinking only when they experience difficulties, hoping that the sorrow or pain will just miraculously disappear. Usually, they find that the place of suffering, the place where we are broken in spirit, when accepted and embraced, is also a place of peace and possibility. How many times do we maybe prolong suffering because of our resistance to accept it? You know what I mean? It's just a thought popped in my head. I don't have any larger pontifications on it, but if you have any insight on it, let me know in the comments. Our sufferings do not magically end. Instead, we are able to wisely, alchemically recycle them. They become the abundant waste that we use to make new growth possible. This is why biblical scripture admonishes us to count it all joy when we meet various trials. I have problems with the way, I don't know, I kind of get the context that Bell is, but growing up in church, that is one of the verses that was often used to promote a lot of toxicity. And it's essentially again, that spiritual bypassing of I know you're going through a lot, but Jesus has a plan. So count it all joy, brother. Count it all joy, sister. And it's but in that space of acceptance, right? And maybe understanding that some way along the way, this is going to be a benefit to you. It's going to help you if you want to, if you embrace it, if you accept it, if you move through it, to learn some sort of lesson, right? To become better discerning, to gain wisdom. All of that can be true when we're going through some sort of suffering or some sort of trial. In that space, you're allowed to examine it. You're allowed to question it. You're allowed to be what the fuck, right? You're allowed to be angry about it. You're allowed to have whatever emotions come up for you about your suffering. And so sometimes in that kind, it was almost used in as a real kind of pithy way to just dismiss the person's actual experience of suffering. So it's oh, well, count it all joy. And it's fuck, man. So not saying that's what Belle is saying. Maybe she is, but maybe I have some triggers to work through there. Of my own, I hate it. I hate it when people use it that way. Anyway, let's continue. Learning to embrace our suffering is one of the gifts offered by spiritual life and practice. Spiritual practice does not need to be connected to organized religion in order to be meaningful. Some individuals find their sacred connection to life communing with the natural world and engaging in practices that honor life-sustaining ecosystems. We can meditate, pray, go to temple, church, mosque, or create a quiet sanctuary where we live to commune with the Holy Spirits. To some folks, daily service to others is an affirmative spiritual practice, one that expresses their love for others. When we make a commitment to staying in touch with the divine forces that inform our inner and outer world, we are choosing to lead the life in spirit. I study spiritual teachings as a guide for reflection and action. Countercultural spiritual awakening. So this is one of the things, like with the church that I'm a part of, that causes me not to completely just bail from church. One, people I'm deeply connected to, but where I wish they would, I don't know, where I wish they would kind of go harder into some of this stuff. And I don't know if you guys can hear it. Like, I have one neighbor who is constantly, like almost all the time, multiple times a day, accidentally setting off their car alarm. It just went off. I hope. But I remember one of the pastors at my church, a guy named Scott, who I adore. They're fantastic. One of the pithy things, one of the spiritual bypasses that we see a lot culturally is when something happens and then people of faith, particularly normally Christians, will say something like thoughts and prayers. And then I remember Scott addressing that one time in a sermon, and he was like, yeah, thoughts and prayers, but we should be praying for how to act, like asking the Lord, if we believe in the Lord who gives us wisdom and insight and directs us and moves, and like we should be praying unto action. Like, Lord, what do we do here? How do we move here? And I just always appreciate that kind of insight, that kind of nuance that is like different than just saying, oh, I'm praying for you. And he's like, no, prayerful action. Like, that's what we're seeking. Anyway, when we make a commitment to staying in touch with divine forces that inform our inner and outer world, we are choosing to lead a life in the Spirit. I study spiritual teachings as a guide for reflection and action. That's what made me think of Scott. Countercultural spiritual awakening is visible in books and magazines and in small circles where individuals come to celebrate and commune with the divine. Fellowship with other seekers after truth offers essential inspiration. Since the earliest roots of my spiritual practice were in the Christian tradition, I still find the traditional church to be a place of worship and fellowship. And I also participate in a Buddhist practice. I meditate and I pray. Everyone has to choose the spiritual practice that best enhances their life. This is why progressive seekers after truth urges all of us to be tolerant, to remember that though our paths are many, we are made one community in love. The spiritual awakening that is slowly taking place counterculturally will become more of a daily norm as we all willingly break mainstream cultural taboos that silence or ease our passion for spiritual practice. For a long time, many of my friends and work peers had no idea I was devoted to spiritual practice. Among progressive thinkers and scholars, it was much more hip, cool, and acceptable to express atheistic sentiments than to declare passionate devotion to divine spirit. I also did not want folks to think that if I talked about my spiritual beliefs, I was trying to convert them, to impose those beliefs on them in any way. I began to speak more openly about the place of spirituality in my life when witnessing the despair of my students, their sense of hopelessness, their fears that life is without meaning, their profound loneliness and lovelessness. When young, bright, beautiful students would come to my office and confess their despondency, I felt it was irresponsible to just listen and commiserate with their woes without daring to share how I had confronted similar issues in my own life. Often, they would urge me to tell them how I sustained my joy in living. To tell the truth, I had to be willing to talk openly about spiritual life. And I had to find a way to talk about my choices that did not imply that they would be correct or right choices for someone else. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's kind of tough because that's one of the things, and this may be me, but growing up, it's like, well, if you're not a Christian, what do you have? You have no meaning without God, and da-da-da-da. And since then, it's like expanding my perspective. There's plenty of people that do not believe in any sort of divine presence whatsoever that have been able to successfully find meaning in their life and find joy and completeness and happiness. And I know that Bella's kind of saying like, yeah, that's their version of spiritual practice, and honor that, and that's fine. But I also like, I don't know. I like in where she talks about here, like just remembering all the paths are many. Like, how would someone who is irreligious in particular, or doesn't believe in any spiritual whatsoever, but still has a rich, meaningful life, how would they feel? And if you're one of those people, let me know, hearing this. Do you kind of go, yeah, I see what she's saying? Or do you kind of like, I can imagine where it's like, I don't like really being lumped in there because like that's not the experience for me. Like, I appreciate the response maybe. I don't know. Let me know what you think. My belief that God is love, that love is everything, our true destiny sustains me. I affirm these beliefs through daily meditation and prayer, through contemplation and service, through worship and loving kindness. In the introduction to Loving Kindness, Sharon Salzberg teaches that the Buddha describes spiritual practice as the liberation of the heart, which is love. She urges us to remember that spiritual practice helps us overcome the feeling of isolation, which uncovers the radiant, joyful heart within each of us and manifests this radiance to the world. Everyone needs to be in touch with the needs of their spirit. This connectedness calls us to spiritual awakening to love. In the biblical book of John, as a passage reminds us that anyone who does not know love is still in death. All awakening to love is spiritual awakening. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 is next. Obviously, that's how numbers work. There wasn't anything in there that really stuck out to me as like, I don't know if I disagree, but there were things that, and I think it's still a byproduct of my own deconstruction too, and also my awareness of others, like encountering others outside of the religious community that I grew up in, and also honoring their experiences and their positions as equally as valid as mine. And so I kind of wonder, I struggle to be like, if someone is expressing their experience, is to kind of put it all in the same bucket, and like, yeah, that's me too, I just call it this, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, that's what I mean by spirit. And like, that person's like, yeah, but I'm not trying to talk to you about that, you know what I mean? So I don't know how that fleshes out interpersonally. But then I also agree, broad strokes, like in the broadest of sense, like, yeah, awakening to love is a spiritual, whatever you define spiritual as, is the spirit. A spiritual awakening is an awakening to love. Okay, I hear what you're saying there. So I don't like disagree, but I'm also like, I don't know. I wonder how that chapter's. I know there are some people that are non-religious in our Discord group I told you about. If you want to interact more, you can let me know down here in the comments. You can find me on those other socials that I mentioned before, the TikTok and the Instagrams, under Dope Dad. If you want to interact more one-on-one and join our group, you can do that as well. I think I'm going to propose that question over there in the Discord and see what some of the answers I get are. Until then, enjoy some tea or coffee, whatever drink of your choice, and grace and peace.